Welcome back to WMD podcast. So today we have our usual esteemed panel of guests here. We are going to talk about new escalations that we have seen in the past couple of weeks on in Middle East as well as Russia-Ukraine front. And to talk about these very important developments, I have with us media theorist Professor Oliver Boyd Barrett, Democratic candidate for Michigan 5th District Christian Vukasovich, and media scholar and media historian Ben Thompson. So welcome, gentlemen. And yeah, so without much ado, I think there is a lot of developments that need to be talked about. So I will move over to Oliver. So Oliver, what do you make of these developments?
Sure. Thank you so much, Samantha. And I do hope that we'll hear a lot from you too, because, of course, you've been covering these crises from the other side of my world, which is in California, from a very important part of the world, which is deeply impacted by the energy crisis in the Gulf. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing that perspective too. But if let us start talking about the situation in Iran. We've seen now, I think we're into the 12th, or is it coming up to the 13th night where we can expect further attacks on Iran by the United States and further attacks by Iran on US military assets and some other assets, including desalination plants in the Gulf and I believe on Israel as well. The situation does seem even more tense today than it has been on any subsequent day since the formal collapse of the MOU. The 14 points that the United States was supposed to have agreed with Iran as a framework for negotiations, but which then almost immediately, and I'm going to just say it bluntly as I see it, you may, of course, disagree, but almost immediately, in my view, it was the United States that began to violate the MOU by issuing threats against Iran when the first paragraph of the MOU ruled that kind of language out of court. And also the United States showed itself demonstrably incapable and unwilling to bring an end to Israelis' invasion of southern Lebanon. So what we've seen over the past few nights, extensive damage to both sides to this conflict. And yesterday and today, I think finally, we began to see the rise of oil prices, yes, to levels which began, I won't say they are yet at panic levels, but they are beginning to have that whiff of panic about them. They haven't yet reached the peaks that they reached before the MOU was allegedly agreed, but they are getting there. It's difficult to say exactly what those prices are because it is just amazing, actually, the lack of definition of this term price when it comes to oil. But I'm going to loosely say that the formal market price of Brent crude today is around $90 a barrel. But that the futures market is considerably higher, approaching $100 a barrel, while people who seem to be in the know about these things say that, yeah. But what people are actually paying in dollar bills is more like 140 or 150. So I don't profess to understand exactly how that works, but it's beginning to look a bit scary. And in addition to that, May,
Yeah. So
may I just
yeah,
quickly just finish this thought?
yeah,
I learned today that the 10-year Treasury bill, which is an indicator of economic health of the United States, basically, it is now at the level of 4.7 percent, and many experts are saying that if it gets to 5%, we are entering the territory at which it becomes quite difficult for the United States to begin to honor its debt obligations. So that seems to me to be quite serious, and it must be putting immense pressure on President Trump and on the administration.
yeah. So I was just going to say that those of us who thought that this economic pressure, rising oil prices, and um, the strategic reserves, diminishing strategic reserves, were forced the MOU, are kind of trying to understand what will force more sense. Yeah, and a bit about the oil prices. It appears that when they talk about typical Brent values, they are talking about some kinds of contracts, and when they talk about actual contracts, the short-term contracts that people are buying, then the actual prices are much higher. So there appears to be that kind of a dynamic there. So yes, yeah. So Christian, what do you think about this rising hostility?
Well, I mean, we talked weeks ago when the MOU was signed that how difficult this was going to be in order to honor this MOU. Not because it wasn't important, not because everyone stood to gain from it and everyone stood to lose from violations of it, but simply because we're bringing together three different sides who don't necessarily understand what they all have in common and how important this is. I mean, we've got people making decisions who don't care about the impact on their population, that don't seem to understand or appreciate how this is increasing the costs for people on the ground. On the cover of things, we've already lost 18 servicemen and women. They've been killed since the start of this conflict in February 28th of this year. That does not include the 447 to 500 plus servicemen and women who are injured so far in this conflict. And now it's been 13 consecutive nights since the MOU has fallen apart and the airstrikes have hit. I mean, it's it's not just a sporadic violations. We've had B-1 long-range bombers who are hitting Iranian maritime assets and their command nodes, but it doesn't seem to be enough to bring Iran to the table. In fact, there has been no real movement from them to try to restart these conversations and restart negotiations. Part of that can be that they just aren't feeling the pain yet. I mean, they're obviously feeling some pain. I mean, we've seen massive destruction of their infrastructure. We've seen at least 1,500 civilians have been killed and over 2,000 of their own military personnel who have been killed. But there's also a lack of a trustworthy negotiation partner in terms of the United States, and Israel has already sort of abandoned all pretext of being involved in this. They seem to view themselves as being apart from any and all of these agreements, despite the verbiage of the MOU. So obviously, what we've seen is just a return to the tactics that work from Iran, and that's targeting maritime traffic. And it's not just the shipping targets, but it's all in the Strait of Hormuz. It's also Houthi proxies who are targeting shipping in the Red Sea. And what that's done is even more effective to put a block on the movement of oil out of the region. And it's we're already seeing it. Yesterday, when I gassed up, it was under $3 a gallon. And then today, it was $4.25 a gallon to fill up my tank. We've already started to see the impact on this. It's not just gas prices increased, and this is not just in the United States, but the world over is seeing. But it's also the cost of food and goods because transportation costs have increased. In the United States alone, we've already spent just $37 billion on the war initially, but we've also just allocated another $95 billion in emergency funding for this war. And every dollar of that is impacting domestic spending. So the infrastructure that we need to prepare, everybody I talk to on the streets who have to replace a tire or their suspension because our roads are in awful disrepair, all of that spending gets cut in order to support this war effort. All of our social programs are going to feel the brunt of this. All of the future adjustments to taxes that we're hoping to bring down costs, taxes, that's going to be impacted by having to pay off these costs. And that's not to mention just the increased threats that we're feeling here. We may not be in direct missile path from Iran, but we certainly are at a heightened footing when it comes to cyber attacks in the United States and are having to respond to those, but also infrastructure concerns. Can Iran hit our critical power infrastructure here and cause problems for us? When we started talking about this conflict and we started looking at the balance of power, there was a lot of surprise that Iran was able to call the bluff of the United States when it came to our projection of power and that they were able to hold out as much as they did. It's obvious now that they had been preparing for this conflict for decades. And we didn't. We had a president who decided on this conflict at a whim. And our entire military defense of the regions, it was a defensive oriented military engagement that was based upon an assessment of Iranian capability, 10 years ago. It has proven wholly insufficient to really support an offensive war against Iran in this sense. And so Iran has been able to systematically erode that defensive capability. First, starting with the deployment of rather cheap and inexpensive, they're less sophisticated armaments in order to take out the defensive hitting our multi-million dollar radar dishes that are there, hitting our bases. Now, pretty much all of our bases in the region are uninhabitable, are unable to be used. And now they pushed back our defensive shield further and further with their tactics. And now they're hitting Jordan. They're hitting Bahrain. They're hitting Kuwait. And as soon as they hit out and take out those defensive capabilities, they're going to be in range to start hitting and putting direct pressure on Israel and some of our bases further abroad and our allies in the region more effectively because they still are retaining those sophisticated armaments. So what we've seen is a massive cost that's being paid by all parties involved. But what we've also seen is an inevitable writing on the wall of what the ending of this conflict looks like, barring any massive over-escalation in the region. We've seen are witnessing a massive shift in regional geopolitics. And so
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to leave it right there
So
because
those
I'm
are,
sure we
yeah,
have a
so those
lot more
are,
to talk about this issue.
those are important topics, right? So, so in terms of human costs, I must add that in the news over here, we see that Indians are predominantly involved in merchant ships, and they seem to be on every ship, perhaps not just ships that are India flagged. So a day before yesterday, 4 Indians were killed in Odessa in the strike, and overall, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, 59 Indians have been killed. And in the Iran-US conflict, 14 Indians have been killed. So these are sailors who are on these ships. When we hear about ships being attacked in around Strait of Hormuz, Odessa, or Bab el Mandeb, it's more than likely that it could be carrying some Indians. So parties that are so these are really wars that affect the entire world, and the decision is made by a very few. So I think you have also touched upon this very important issue of it appears that there is a strategy this time around. Iranian strikes on US bases have been kind of towards Jordan, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar. All of them are in line with Israel. So perhaps they are planning something there, but Israel is not directly party to this new, U.S. Attacks on Iran. So that is again interesting. So the extension of conflict to Red Sea. I think that's something that we should now talk about. And before I think going to Oliver, who might have some updates for us, let us invite our friend Ben uh, to know his thoughts on the matter. Particularly the MOU. I think it was fairly clear that the conflict in Lebanon had to stop, and the terms of Strait of Hormuz. Point number 5, that it will be Iranian approved passage given the mines. So I wonder what you make of these and any other important developments uh, over the past few days.
Yeah, thank you so much. And by the way, everybody should be feeling for those sailors caught up in these conflicts right now, because that kind of work is very difficult, even when you're not stuck in port for months at a time or having missiles shot at you. It's very, very difficult work, and usually quite poor people who have to um, do that kind of work for months on end at sea. The now, yeah, about the extension of the war and escalation has a lot to do, of course, with the fight over who gets to approve traffic through the strait. The Americans did not want to recognize Iranian control over the strait. The Iranians insisted that every ship that wants to go through the strait, even though there's not supposed to be shooting going on, that it run by them first before moving. And they tried to enforce this several times and ended up hitting a few ships. And the Americans, of course, use that as a uh, reason to escalate to where we are today. Uh, and the interesting thing about this escalation, as you said, I think, is that um, Israel is kind of left out. Does is no longer currently a direct belligerent in this on both fronts here. The Iranian front, uh, there are still American bases in Kuwait getting hit fairly regularly. But if you look at the map and you pay attention to where these things are being hit, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, is not getting hit, at least certainly not in the way that it was in the first part of this war before the ceasefire. The UAE was getting hit probably more than any place in the region. I'm sure Iran was firing more at Israel at the time, but they have superior air defenses, so less got through. Um, but I have heard that the reason why Iran has not been targeting the UAE is because essentially the UAE has paid off Iran, at least for the time being. If you remember, part of the MOU was that Iran would get so many $billion in frozen assets that were taken from it previously, and apparently the UAE has consented to that. So I have no way of confirming that, but that's the best explanation I have of why the UAE is a lot more peaceful right now. Uh, that being said, Jordan being hit much more, other Gulf states being hit less, and it looks like many of those American bases are largely abandoned or partially abandoned. And the US has been trying to resupply itself in Jordan, and so Iran is extending its strikes out that way, which, if you just look at the map, Jordan is kind of the last line of defense before you hit Israel. So I assume what Iran wants is to push the Americans out of pretty much everywhere else in the Arab countries so that the US has to concentrate its forces in Israel or outside of the region entirely. And then and then Iran would be able to only focus on fighting the US and Israel and not have to worry so much about all the messy politics and diplomacy of its immediate neighbors. Um, last couple things I'll just say is the Houthis, interestingly, have also not said much about Israel in this reopening of their front. They said that they are reopening this blockade on Saudi Arabia specifically, not Israel, at least as far as I know. And if you know anything about the Saudi war in Yemen going back 11 years, it makes perfect sense why the Houthis, Ansar Allah, and the Saudi monarchy have been fighting each other for well over a decade at this point. So that's really not surprising and nothing new, but it is certainly an escalation in this conflict. And I I don't think anyone has mentioned this yet, but this uh, this conflict in many ways reminds me of the early days of the Ukraine war, where you had both sides coming up with predictions of how the war was going to go, and usually saying that it was going to be over fairly quickly. The West was saying that Russia was going to collapse from all these sanctions that were being put on it. People thought on the Russian side that Ukraine would collapse quite quickly from the Russian invasion. And I think that conflict and this current conflict just shows that these things can go on for longer than people expect them to, and things that we expect to create a stop, an obstacle from the war continuing, can actually be overcome, and the war can continue and even escalate beyond what people thought possible before. One of the reasons why crude oil prices have not been as bad as people were predicting is because China has apparently cut their imports by half. That's about $5 million barrels a day less that needs to be sold on the market, and that has created a lot of relief, which we'll have to have a conversation about China one of these days. It's very interesting that China seems to be playing a very stabilizing role from here all the way back to if you look at the uh, global financial crisis, China played a very stabilizing role in the global capitalist economy. In some ways, you could say propping up the Americans, even though they never get credit for it and get portrayed as belligerent toward America. Um, so it's this economic warfare is maybe more important even than the physical warfare in some ways, at least in terms of Iran's hope for pressuring the Americans to come to the table. But it's uh, it's very possible that both sides are able to continue this for a while, and I'm not sure when we would actually start to see cracks. Probably having something to do with the elections in the United States, frankly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Oliver, moving over to you, I just add a few thoughts. And I think it is very interesting to see how the conflict between Arab states and Iran has evolved. UAE is not active aggressor this time around, and as Ben pointed, I think this also gives us, to me, it does appear like GCC countries, Arab sheikdoms are very business-like. You had Saudi Arabia entering into a peace deal with Iran under Chinese with some Chinese help, and you had the Saudi delegation going to Iran as well. So it doesn't appear like I don't know, they are cutthroat enemies. I think, end of the day, they want to do business. Um, and the other thing about Bab el Mandeb, if the strait is closed, I think that is now the flashpoint. It might affect Asia more than the Western markets, because you have the Saudi East-West pipeline, and through Yanbu, the oil can still go through Suez Canal. It can't come this way. So yeah, so those are some of my thoughts. So Oliver, how do you see the evolving conflict in the Red Sea and the role of Israel?
One thing that strikes me is that there is a great deal of thought and activity looking into the workarounds of a closure of the Strait of Hormuz. There hasn't been time, well, there has been sufficient time for some of these workarounds to be implemented. So, for example, Saudi Arabia is now exporting much more oil than it did before by pipeline. But now we see, because of the Houthi blockade of Saudi Arabian traffic, that particular workaround may not be working for very much longer, if it still is. But there's a lot of evidence of workarounds, and why shouldn't there be? I mean, it's only a question of just getting the oil from one place to another. And yes, then, of course, you have to ask, well, is this route cheaper than that route, and this, that, and the other? But of course, there were workarounds. So one thing, and I don't have the answer to this, but one thing very much in my mind, and it goes back to Ben, your question, yeah, how long can these guys keep at it? And one element to this is, well, how long does it take to come up with satisfactory workarounds? Because I don't think that the leverage that Iran has been able to exploit, I'm not sure how long-lived that leverage really is. The implication, therefore, may be that Iran has to bring this thing to a head sooner rather than later. And because it knows that the United States maybe, but we can't take anything in all of this discourse for totally for granted. There are so many uncertainties. But if we try just to concentrate on what it is that people are mainly talking about, then absolutely the United States is on the brink. It is running low on its reserves. We were suddenly told only yesterday, as though we had to wait this long for someone to say this. Oh yeah, no, don't worry, guys. we can go down to sort of 75,000 rock bottom before we're in real trouble. Whereas up until now, everyone has been saying no. We're already in dangerous territory. So I don't trust this administration to be honest with us, even with respect of the oil reserves. And that worries me. And then I mentioned a moment ago the whole thing about the 10-year treasury bonds. That sounds pretty dire as well. We also are told from many quarters, both within the military-industrial complex and its critics, that the US is running out of missiles. It's been pouring so much weaponry into Ukraine that even so-called essentials like Patriot launches and Patriot missiles, PAC-3s, I believe, interceptor missiles, that these are in very short supply now. Even Zelensky is begging every day, for more of these things. It wouldn't matter that much even if he got them, because the Russian hypersonic missiles, for the most part, cannot be brought down, or they cannot be intercepted by the Patriot missiles anyway. But the United States has a weapons supply problem. Its stockpiles are relatively low. There are and of course, at home, we're seeing the gasoline prices. They didn't fall in line with the fall in the price of crude. And now, they're already beginning to pick up, and they're back to more or less where they were at the previous peak of this crisis. So I'm thinking, Ben raised the question. It's a thoroughly good question. How long can these guys hold out? Is this really a battle to see who can survive the longest? I think we may very well be there. And if China, and again, thank you for mentioning China, Ben. If we're told that China, up until now, it has extraordinary reserves of its own. Chinese oil reserves exceed the oil reserves of the rest of the world put together. So China's been able to hold out. It hasn't been buying much oil recently, but now it looks as though it is having to come back into the market. And when it does, when that Chinese demand hits the market, then that's going to put ever greater pressure on the already falling oil reserves of the other nations. It's going to make even the physical supply of oil to all who want it impossible. I mean, we're kind of almost there. Well, we were almost there with respect to Pakistan a few weeks ago, and I think we're going to see that in many more parts of the world quite soon, unless there is some radical change to the current situation. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so thank you, Oliver. So I do think even though the workarounds around Hormuz are being developed, the pipelines can't be constructed overnight. It does appear that Emirates is going to increase. Is going to actually double the amount of oil that is going through their pipeline to Fujairah, which is not actually very far from Strait of Hormuz. So I don't know how much that would help, but this doubling is going to take an year. So now they are also talking about other pipelines through Iraq and Turkey. So in the short run, I think the pain is quite inescapable. It also appears that China has resumed buying oil. So it did reduce its purchases by a good 5 to 6 million barrels during the peak of the conflict. But some reports I have seen, the China is resuming it. And yeah, I think it's also interesting to note on the China question. It appears that Deng Xiaoping said way back that Middle East has oil and China has rare earth. So it goes to see, I think, the kind of vision and the discipline with which the Chinese have been working over the decades. I think the global universities will soon need to, get out of their West-centric, scholarship and look at this extraordinary development. It also appears that Middle East is kind of preparing for post. So these are again, the pressing concerns are so deep that it's kind of difficult to speculate. But it appears that with this involvement of Pakistan, with Saudi Arabia and others, it does appear like Pakistan is going to step in as some kind of net security provider in Middle East. And as it becomes, as US might wind down its security commitments there. So yeah, the floor is open to other questions, and we can move on to other topics.
Well, Samantha, I'm glad that you brought up a lot of these issues about how people are changing their stance on security in the region. And I think that has been largely overlooked in our press coverage of this. I mean, we sold our alliances as protecting our allies behind the U.S. shield. And what has become abundantly clear is that we've made them targets instead. And, the defensive, logistics that we had put together and the defensive systems that we had put up, they would have worked as a deterrent quite well had we not decided to go on the aggressive and start this war. They would have slowed down any kind of advance and any kind of potential damage from the Iranian missile barrage. But in light of this, what we've seen is Iran has not only realized how effective their missile and drone technology can be in the glide bombs and other issues they have, other armaments that they have, but also the economic war. And we mentioned this, Ben certainly mentioned this. Right now, maritime insurance companies are canceling policies for any ships that are paying tolls to go through those and that's creating bottlenecks. But we've also shut down. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz; it's the Red Sea and transit through there. That's going to be a big hit around the world right now. It's not just the United States or not just China, but we compete for those resources. We end up bidding and getting in bidding wars when resources are scarce. It's not just the oil; it's the fertilizer that's coming through there, and the vast majority of the world's fertilizer comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that's going to impact prices above and beyond. But the shift that we're going to see when it comes to security is also not just going to be how to address the chokehold of oil and gas and fertilizer, but it's how do you deal with the fact that the United States wasn't as effective in protecting our allies in the region as we want it to be and as they expect it to be. And what we're going to see is Gulf countries hedging their bets. And we're already seeing this with Pakistan and how they approach Iran. We're seeing this with UAE and how they are working with Iran. And and once we realize that a lot of our projection of force is dependent upon the belief and the appearance that we can deliver on these things, and if that bluff, as it did here, got called, we're going to see more and more nuance in the region. Unfortunately, our press coverage isn't talking about that nuance, right? We have 24-hour coverage of this conflict, not as much coverage in the United States right now of the conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. But if you go to CNN, if you go to Al Jazeera, you're just going to see it over and over again. And it's saturated with the kind of coverage of raw operational milestones that would be reported, CENTCOM press releases coming out, oil prices and its effect, announcements of blockades and whether they're lifted, whether they're imposed, whether they're being enforced. And then, of course, all the theater of political sound bites that go in. But we also have to remember what's not being said. So in Iran, they've got press blockouts in there. They don't have a lot of coverage on just how much infrastructure damage has occurred. And we're not seeing over here, because they're certainly not talking about it as much in Iran, just the extent of the humanitarian crisis that's happening in this region. Instead, we're talking about the billions of dollars in direct engagement costs. We're talking about the economic damage, which is likely to get much higher. But one important area, and maybe Ben and Oliver and Yusamath can speak to, is what's going on with the lack of coverage exploring of this conflict, the
Yeah.
current strategies that are happening in here, because President Trump just threatened targeting civilian infrastructure. He said, for every ship you hit, we're going to target one of your bridges. We're going to target one of your power plants, your desalination. That's a direct violation of the 1949 Geneva Convention on there. And, while we are mourning as a country, 18 servicemen were dead, and we're viewing on our television screens the dignified transfer of the remains of our fallen, we are not engaging with a fundamental conversation about, where does this put us in the world in violation of international law and war crimes, but also how is this undermining our credibility, our standing on the world stage, and really allowing Iran to elevate itself in that vacuum. So
Yeah, it is. I think it is very interesting to note on that note that Rubio went to UN uh, to kind of argue the case of Strait of Hormuz against Iran, and United States going to UN is kind of ironic after what we have seen. So I think I would like to talk about this Lindsey Graham bill. Um, yeah, the proposed bill, which seems to have bipartisan support, um, is talking about 100% tariffs on Russian oil. And President Trump has recently asked the senators to add Iran to it. So there appears to be a bipartisan, if there is a bipartisan bill against Russian oil and Iranian oil, even if the eventual tariff is not 100%, uh, it's what is the plan there now? Last month, India purchased 50% of its oil from Russia.
yeah,
So where will the bill is actually targeting India. So it has named India, China, and three smaller countries. China may not care, but the debate in the media here is that you cannot buy Russian oil with the tariffs. The refiners are not going to buy if there are tariffs because they have to do business. And we have seen kind of effectiveness of sanctions. Even though politically India says it does not recognize unilateral sanctions, it does abide by them eventually. So we must remember in 2018 India stopped buying Iranian oil. Iran was one of the largest, top two suppliers of oil to India. And what what we are hearing is eventually they will allow selling of Iranian oil if it is sold in dollars. So that is again at the crux of the problem, as you have pointed out. And yeah, so Venezuelan oil is back in the market again, being sold as American oil. And we must recognize that all this oil that India buys from Russia is paid in yuan. So there is this, and we have seen that Saudi Arabia did not renew its petrodollar contract, and UAE is moving forward with alternatives to SWIFT that China has proposed. So this whole dollar hegemony question, I think that is very central. So they are going to allow, apparently, just like the Iraqi oil and Venezuelan oil, they are going to allow Iranian oil if it is sold in dollars. So that's one of the things that is being talked about, and Russian oil as well. So I think we got to look at how these alternatives to payment systems evolve. The other thing that this is kind of unique. This might interest you, Oliver, particularly. So India is under a lot of sanctions, which people might not realize on its missile program. It has the technology to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles, but it doesn't test them. And the sanctions are Russia oriented, Russian oil and Russian defense products. India has relied on traditionally on Russian defense. So there are CATSA sanctions against India buying Russian equipment. And India has been making more efforts to buy from Western countries and reduce its dependence on Russia for defense and oil. However, the complaint that we hear from Indians is that yeah, I mean, when you look at Pakistan, 85% of Pakistan's defense products come from China, and United States doesn't bother about that. But when it comes to India buying, defense or energy products from Russia, United States is has historically been very, upset about it. So I think the deeper historical point that they are trying to make is the West views India as a destabilizer and China as a stabilizer in South Asia. Perhaps that would extend to Middle East as the conflict. Yeah, so there are these nuances, which yeah, which are interesting to note. Um, Perhaps we'll have another time to kind of expand on as the BRICS conference comes up. We should take more time out to talk about China, Russia, India, Brazil. There have been a lot of moves in that part of the world. China has recently started an AI, you know, international AI effort, and 29 countries signed up to it. So they are, building something there. So yeah, so I would like to open the floor to both Ben and Oliver on these important issues. Oliver is talking about treasury bonds, and I have also heard online by several commentators that yeah, as the war progresses, servicing the debt is going to become difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to. No, I'd love to hear from Ben, particularly with respect to any of the media dimensions. Since Ben, this is something that your own work has looked at in great detail.
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say that the media coverage of this war has been a bit confused, because they're generally against Trump, but they have a long grudge against the Iranians, and the Zionist Israel lobby has also been extremely influential in American media. Um, I think there's a sense of wanting to, at least for media aligned with the Democratic Party, wanting to sort of drag this out into a midterm issue so that they can make Trump look bad, but they also, you can see in their coverage of the war itself, as well as the Democratic Party's response to the legal implications of the war, that is trying to get war powers resolutions passed, that they don't actually want to stop this thing, because they do want to have this war, or they want to see Iran weakened, and if they can weaken Trump at the same time, then I think that is something generally acceptable for them. Beyond, I've just noticed a great quietness, I think, about this whole thing, that they could be making things much more difficult for Trump if they were actually serious about uh, following the law and being an opposition party. But they are kind of hoping that this does enough damage to Iran in the long term, and enough damage to Trump in the short term, that they can benefit from it overall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me
I,
just briefly.
could I just
Yeah, I
quickly
wanted.
just may I pick up, Samantha, on the Ben has been talking about the amongst other things, the role of the Israeli lobby, and this is something that we've talked about in previous programs, and I'd like to pick up on it though with respect to Israel and the behavior of Israel, to put it mildly, is extraordinarily perplexing. And it's central, isn't it, to the Iranian conflict? So we saw this week, for example, there's a really bewildering change of direction by Donald Trump over the past day with respect to the issue of the US-Saudi nuclear deal. So this is a deal, as I understand it, whereby the United States will supervise, make possible uranium enrichment by Saudi Arabia. You know, the very thing that apparently this war is being fought with Iran to stop. You have to laugh because otherwise you just weep. So according to Trump and people like Peter Hegseth, who's even worse than Trump in trying to justify every ill-advised action of the administration in terms of, well, we've stopped Iran getting a nuclear weapon, or we will never allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And now all of a sudden, Trump is making it possible, or seems to be putting Saudi Arabia on the path towards having the same kind of potential nuclear capability in terms of weaponization as Iran is supposed to have. He already cut a deal like that with the United Arab Emirates, which, by the way, let us not overlook, is a kind of Israeli proxy amongst in the Gulf as well, and. So what now? Trump has backtracked since over the last 24 hours because he's now insisting, well, yeah, we can do this deal with Saudi Arabia, but only if Saudi Arabia agrees to the Abrams Accords, which are essentially a treaty of friendship and recognition of and treaty of friendship with Israel. Something, by the way, which Saudi Arabia, amazingly to my mind, actually has refused to do until Israel has resolved the Palestinian problem, until Israel has brought an end, in effect, to the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. But the seed is there. And why wouldn't it be? Because Saudi Arabia has already got an understanding, if not a treaty, with Pakistan, whereby Pakistan includes Saudi Arabia within Pakistan's so-called nuclear umbrella. Frankly, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable under any kind of umbrella that Pakistan offered me. So complex and devious are Pakistani politics, if I may say so. But Trump is involving himself in this very strange relationship, the nuclear relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, the nuclear issue of Iran, the most important fact of Iran, of course, is that it has no nuclear weapon. Everyone knows it has no nuclear weapon. Anyone of consequence, that is to say, the American intelligence community, the IAEA, and anyone who's looked at this issue in any depth knows, not only up until now, I have to say this, up until this war, there was no doubt that Iran did not have a nuclear weapon. Iran was not conceivably a nuclear threat, not least because the former supreme leader had said that this is a sin. It's something that Iran can never do, nor can it use chemical weapons, by the way. And whatever small amount of evidence that Iran ever contemplated nuclear capability from a weapons point of view, I think is just is another Israeli fabrication. I don't believe a word of it. I don't think Iran was ever even thinking about acquiring a nuclear weapon, despite all the rubbish that Israel has poured into the international negotiation about this. But I'm coming back. See how extraordinarily contradictory things have now become, where Trump is prepared to put Saudi Arabia on some kind of nuclear capability path, something that apparently can never ever happen for Iran. And the impact, the immediate impact of that, of course, is that Turkey and Egypt would immediately insist that they now too have the same discretion as Saudi Arabia, and there will be a nuclear arms race. So it's a little bit parallel to the story about the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war started, the Strait of Hormuz was open, and everyone had free passage through the strait, and global trade was doing very nicely. Thank you. Now, but now, of course, it's closed and we have a global trading crisis for which Trump is directly responsible. And the same thing, the administration was saying that the principal reason, the main reason for this war is to stop Iran becoming a nuclear power. Let's forget, as US media always will forget, let's forget that Israel has, is it 200, 300, 400 nuclear weapons and has had them now for decades. That apparently is totally irrelevant. But with the thought of Iran acquiring just one nuclear weapon, and now Trump has green-lighted a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. It was already getting bad enough with Pakistan because of the Pakistani-Indian conflicts, and now Turkey. I never felt terribly comfortable with Pakistan having a nuclear weapon, I have to admit. And now, well, I feel comfortable with Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia having nuclear weapons. This is just stupidity piled upon stupidity, built upon stupidity. I frankly think that the Democrats, and I know I'm speaking to someone who I very much hope will be successful in the upcoming elections, but I do wish that the Democrats would stop falling in all of this war chatter, smearing Iran, speaking as though they took seriously for a moment the concept of Iran as a nuclear threat, always forgetting to mention that Israel is already a secure nuclear power. We have to develop through the media. It comes back to the media. We have a media system in which we are not even given the language that we need in order to really address the real problems that we really have.
Well, I think you're bringing up some really important points here. I mean, one, it's notable. It's not just notable, it's alarming, the fact that we are now almost on a dime turning around and rushing towards more nuclear proliferation in this world. From the START program treaty to the START 2 treaty, it had been the consensus that it was absolutely insane to be engaged in this nuclear arms race around the world, that we were all collectively safer and more secure by limiting nuclear proliferation. The fact that this is being used as sort of a deal, that this is on the table, that this is something that we can engage with as a part of bartering with allies and with interests in the area, it goes against everything that we had established as part of our world order that we wanted to see during the Cold War. I think I also see a lot of challenges here in terms of there is no real difference between the Republican hawks and the Democratic hawks when it comes to what's happening in Iran. When I talk to people on the ground, and I've got a unique perspective now because I'm actively engaged in a campaign, and that means I'm knocking on people's doors. I'm actively going to people who are, not necessarily I'm preaching to the choir. I'm going to people who are oftentimes voters for the other party or very much independent voters. And what I'm hearing is very different from what the Republican line is with Lindsey Graham's bill, and certainly very different from the Democratic line and the aggressiveness towards Iran. I'm talking to people every day who are hurting, who are having trouble filling up their gas tank to get to work. I'm talking to retirees who are deeply concerned about U.S. Treasury bonds and whether the world will still have confidence in our treasury bonds, largely because for those who are fortunate enough and had enough money to invest, their security in their retirement comes largely from treasury bonds in there. And so, across the board, when I talk to people, nobody wants us to be engaged in this conflict. They're worried about their sons and daughters and nephews and nieces who are serving over there, fathers and mothers who are over there. They're worried about the impact that they're seeing every day. On their cost of their food, on the cost of their gas, on the cost of fertilizers for our farmers in the field. I think it's really important to understand that there's a disconnect between the American people and their appetite for this and the hawks that are both on the Democratic and Republican parties that are there. And like you, I'm very frustrated with that. I don't understand why they see short-sighted gains in our midterm elections and how this is going to hamstring the incumbent in office as being worth the trade-off and comes in terms of the damage to the global economy, in terms of damage to the American economy, in terms of the fundamental upsetting of our world order that has uh, largely benefited the West and certainly the United States in that manner. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a few quick thoughts. I was watching a podcast on Atlantic, and I think that kind of summarizes what I feel about media, mainstream Western media particularly. So the conversation was that regime change in Iran is very desirable, but Trump is doing it the wrong way. You got to do it the right way, and so that's I think a really sorry state of affairs. So it is quite perplexing that there is a great deal of opposition to the Trump's war on Iran, but yeah,
Which also begs the question, America doesn't have a really good track record of doing regime change in Iran
yeah,
in the right way. Uh,
yeah,
when you
absolutely.
look back at our history.
And
So, yeah.
and also the bipartisan support to the Lindsey Graham bill and sanctioning of Russian oil. So that is also, I find it quite disturbing because I'm sitting here in a country which is last month it got 50% of its oil from Russia. So how will these economies, global South economies, do without oil? If you just take everything out, and then you will be left with overpriced oil and demand destruction. So decades of growth, bringing people out of poverty, will be washed out. So that's the question of nuclear proliferation. I mean, nobody's talking about nuclear disarmament. The institutions were built back in the day with the goal of nuclear disarmament, but we've
Yeah.
seen proliferation, and it appears that, see, nobody's talking about. When I was at Bowling Green, uh, North Korea was an issue in Western media, and now with ICBMs and nuclear weapons, they are out of the picture. Hypersonic missiles, drones, right? And ICBMs. Uh, Wars are becoming increasingly unsustainable. Military victories with these kinds of technologies are difficult on for any country. And also, with all this, what kind of credibility does US bring with it when it's talking to, say, Russia? The Rubio Lavrov talks about a peace deal over there, right? So yeah, so Oliver, I know you wanted to talk about the other front which has been heating up as well.
Yes, it's been extremely interesting trying to monitor this situation over the past few weeks, especially from the perspective of what we can loosely refer to as the alternative media, which by and large, during the 4.5 years or so of this war so far, have done a very commendable job in presenting us with a credible, well substantiated, empirically substantiated narrative that went that worked alternative to the narrative of the mainstream, the Western mainstream media. So I'm not going to go down that particular rabbit hole just now. I'm just going to presume that we kind of know what I'm talking about here, and that most of our listeners will know what I'm talking about here. We kind of know what we can expect Western mainstream media to tell us about the war, what I call the NATO's proxy war with Russia over Ukraine, and what kind of perspectives we can expect. What can we expect to see in the alternative media? Now, just recently, I've begun to have I've begun to detect some interesting subdivisions within the alternative media narrative. The alternative media narrative is fine when it comes to accepting, as I do accept, and I believe is the empirically correct position to take, that this has never been a Russian offensive war. It has always been a Russian defensive war against a Western plan published for all to read and for all to see in reports like the RAND report extending Russia of 2019, which is namely that the West needs to break up the Russian Federation so that Western capital can move in and exploit the mineral and the other wealth of the Russian Federation. That is fundamentally what this is all about, although there are many, many nuances, of course. And the Western, the alternative media have therefore adopted a very sympathetic understanding of this war, and have been, up until this point in time at least, have been broadly very appreciative of what seemed to them to be a rather cunning, very mild, very rational attritional war strategy adopted by Putin. And this became the broad framework within which all these issues about, oh, Russia is moving so slowly, why can't it be like a World War II movie where we conquer the enemy before tea time? No. This is a war we've been told being fought according to this very, very strategic and militarily sophisticated player. And that's worked quite well up until this point in time. But now, since the beginning of 2026, we began to see, and I think it's largely because of the infusion, the direct involvement of Western countries in the in the production, in the assembly of drones. We've seen a major spike in the development not only of the drones themselves, but in the ways in which the drones are applied against Russia and into the very, very heartland of Russia, attacking on many occasions Moscow, attacking very many, if not a considerable proportion of all of Russia's main refineries and other such targets. I don't think that seems to have evaporated a little bit of late, although I don't think it's gone away. I do notice with great interest Ukraine's new interest in bombing warehouses belonging to Russia's equivalent to Amazon in order to begin to impact the economy on a very basic level at which all consumers will suddenly become aware are directly impacted by the war on a day-to-day basis, if they have not already been impacted by sight of drones hitting refineries and oil storages and military ammo dumps and things of that kind. And then, even more alarmingly, to my mind, despite the fact that many of my so-called colleagues in the alternative media did their very, very best to minimize this, we saw Ukraine not only reduce Crimea by through their drone strikes, shutting down the supply of gasoline to citizens living in Crimea. But then, because Crimea was now so weak militarily, Russia has actually withdrawn troops from Crimea at this very point of the crisis, which I think is extraordinary, making it even easier for Ukrainian drones to hit Russian targets in the Sea of Azov, where they've been busily, I believe the number I've seen is that they have in the last week or so damaged or destroyed almost 200 Russian vessels, which are either oil storage tankers belonging to the so-called, shadow fleet, the Russian shadow fleet, or more importantly, grain cargo ships. Russia is the world's single most important source of grain for the global south. By the way, Ukraine ranks as number 2. This seemed to be a very disturbing development at many, many different levels. Even if you were not in favor of Putin or not in favor of the Russian position on this war, it began to seem quite dangerous for the world, because the more pressure you put on Russia, which regards this crisis as existential for Russians, this is about whether Russians can still have their own country or not. That's what it's about. And if they're forced to go nuclear, of course they'll go nuclear. But so far, not so, despite the encouragement by some advisors to Putin that he needs to use not so much his nuclear weapons, but his non-nuclear, nuclear equivalent weapons like the Oreshnik as a demonstration to the West that it's time to stop playing this silly game. Because when push comes to shove, Russia has many, many strong cards to play. So that's the point at which we were, I think, last week. And then all of a sudden, and this is, for every action, there is a counteraction. So what is the counteraction to the Ukrainian bombing of the vessels in the Sea of Azov, and also along the ports of the eastern Black Sea that are part of Russia, where there are also many grain vessels and many so-called shadow fleet tankers. The response has been a devastating night after night after night of bombardments by Russia on the port of Odessa. The vessels, the port infrastructure, warehouses throughout the oblast of Odessa. And this signals to me that Odessa is actually no longer part of Ukraine. Effectively, Odessa is no longer part of Ukraine. Russia has isolated Odessa from the rest of Ukraine in the same way that the Ukrainians have tried to isolate Crimea from the broader mainland of the Russian Federation. Who's the first to suffer from this? Well, of course, the Ukrainian economy will not be helped. The supply of grain to the nations of the south will be badly impacted. Yes, there are alternative routes, a little bit like the Strait of Hormuz. There are alternative routes, but those alternative routes are always more expensive. That's why up until now they've been using Odessa. You send it to the Romanian port of Constanța further down on the Black Sea. If that was such a good idea, people would have thought of that before. And now the price of grain and the price of fertilizers and all those other commodities that went through or out of Odessa ports. Odessa has at least 3 main ports. So we have a battle of narratives in the Western mainstream media. Very, very much want us all to believe that Ukraine is actually winning the war. But how is it then that if Ukraine is winning the war, Ukraine just had to sack its commander-in-chief? How is it, by the way, that in 4 years, this is now the 3rd commander-in-chief that Ukraine has had to resort? That doesn't seem to be the behavior of a winning country, and I don't think the Ukraine is remotely winning this conflict. Inasmuch as it's got any winning cards to show, is because Ukraine is a proxy. It's like Israel. Israel is a proxy, and it's a proxy for the West. Because and the West people, one wonders how is it that the British, which have a minuscule army and a minuscule navy, who don't even have the authority to use their own nuclear weapons because they're actually controlled by the United States. How is it that Britain under Starmer and even again under the new guy, Andrew Burnham, he's going down the same path? How is it that they think it's a really good idea to send British taxpayer money, billions of dollars of it, to Ukraine? How does that quite work in British interest? Well, these guys really and truly do believe that ultimately payday will arrive. Ultimately, the Russian Federation will be smashed into smithereens, which it won't, by the way. Basically, it's a single Slavic state with a Slavic civilization. Yeah, I know there's a few complications to that little narrative, but these people are not going to allow themselves to be smashed into smithereens. No way. But that's what Britain has persuaded itself. That's the advantage that Britain, the people who for half a century controlled, they like to believe, 75% of the world. I wouldn't trust. I don't trust British politicians in whatever color they come. They're still all part of the same imperial machine, yearning, lusting to return to their imperial glory on the back of their centuries-old enemy, Russia. I better stop there. I'm sorry I went on for so long.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver, for bringing up all these important issues. So I think this issue of food and energy crisis, which will disproportionately affect global South, is we are not finding it as much in the Western mainstream press. There was a report that Christian and I have pointed about, the Lancet study, which said that 3 billion meals will be off the tables in global South. Russia is a major grain supplier, largest wheat supplier. Ukraine is second. And this whole business of don't buy Russian oil and don't buy Iranian oil, and the way it affects India, long-standing partnerships that India has had with Russia and Iran. And now this, with these sanctions threats, now they are moving closer and closer to US. So how it impacts, people in global South, their energy needs, their food, it's definitely an issue. Yeah.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, Ben, why don't you go ahead?
Go ahead, Christian.
No, all right. I think it's interesting how we lack a lot of really important narratives. So, Sumanth, you were just bringing in how do these conflicts impact the rest of the world? We should also be asking how does a global recession impact us back here at home? Because there's no winner in this conflict. And we should also, you would expect if media were doing their job, they would be exploring how different conflicts are interconnected. How when we start limiting the amount of oil on the market coming out of producers such as, Venezuela, such as Russia, how that sort of exacerbates this chokehold that we have on oil coming out of the Middle East. And I don't see a lot of winners in this overall conflict. What we see is just sort of who can hold on the longest till the other one gives up, the classic war of attrition. And, when they cover it in the press, the broader Western media coverage really just seems to be in a sense of fatigue, media fatigue. They don't really cover anymore the war in Ukraine. Unless there's a major humanitarian disaster that occurs or a threat to that. And that, I think, is in a large part because of the incremental nature of Russian advances. There's no strong punch through. I mean, there's always a possibility that there's some kind of breakthrough from either side that changes the balance dramatically. But let's face it, since the start of this conflict, it's been a grind. It's been a slog. It's been a massive waste of human life and disaster all along. Um, and when it's covered in Russian news, it really covers this sector. It covers it pretty heavily, but very specifically as a decisive battle, right? They try to, it's almost like we are on the edge of a breakthrough in every Russian news coverage, and we're looking at, particularly right now, the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, you know, region on this. That's an anchor of the Ukrainian sort of fortress belt in the Donetsk. And and it is a grind there. There's 90,000 civilians who are still trapped in the area, despite how many thousands left because of the massive air bombardment and artillery bombardments in there. When analysts talk about it, they talk about that if Russia is able to take that and capture that stronghold, it could still take years in that. And there's a lack, despite the fact that there's a lack of medical staff in the agglomeration, and there's a disruption of power and fuel. But what we're seeing is this spread, right, from this war of attrition on the battlefield with the Russian bombardment that Oliver was talking about of Odessa, with the Ukrainian bombardment of ports in throughout Crimea and in Russia and the Sea of Azov. It's this move towards moving it from the battlefield. The battlefield's now moving to the logistics hubs. And we're not talking about, as Oliver mentioned, what that means in a wider sense for the rest of the world. When we start hitting them with drones, with glide bombs, with heavy artillery, which has really been the workhorse of this entire conflict in there, those logistic hubs have become combat zones with far-reaching implications. And I don't see this conflict ending soon. I think that this is just the hammering of these logistic hubs is just going to grind down that war of attrition even slower. It's going to make it take a lot longer. Ukraine is going to pour as many resources as it can as to holding any kind of anchor. It's the administrative capital for the Donetsk. For them, it sits right on the northern Donetsk Donbass Canal, the Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal, which provides the agglomeration with a lot of water security and with some kind of industrial viability. Right there, it's a critical piece, and so it's going to get as much strengthening as it can get. It's definitely a piece of leverage in any kind of peace talks that are in there because it resists territorial concessions as it is there. I think it's a shame that the media coverage in Russia is tried, really focused on what's the next breakthrough and what's, on the ground, what's the next decisive battle. That Western media coverage is really, really flagging unless there's some kind of humanitarian, I guess, disaster candy, eye candy for press in that sense, in that very disturbing sense. But meanwhile, we're watching this influx, the impact on the rest of the world. We're watching the grain shipments that are not getting to the people who need them. We're watching the energy crisis that the world is facing, becoming exacerbated as it is. It seems to me that, this is all of these battles, whether we're talking about Iran, whether we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, everybody seems to be going for a victory that'll end up being a Pyrrhic victory in the end. And we just have to keep asking ourselves, why can't we engage in a better way of resolving these conflicts? Because, all we've seen from the beginning, all the way through has been a stalemate and a loss and loss all around. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we can invite closing thoughts on broadening of the conflict, right? Particularly in Middle East, between Saudis and Houthis. And if Bab el Mandab Strait closes, it'll become more difficult for so how long can Asian countries, global South countries go with this kind of supply crunch of food and energy? It appears quite unsustainable, and there is no end in sight. The other issue is that of ground invasion. We are seeing people talk about ground invasion, and can ground invasion really open the Strait of Hormuz when we know Iran is a large country with drones and a large coastline. So I mean, there is a talk about taking some of those islands, Kashim Island and Abu Musa, between UAE um, and Iran. But those moves would require U.S. Mobilization from Omani side, Oman and UAE side into Iran, because eventually they have to get supplies from this end.
Well, it's
So
costly, right, Sumant? That's costly, and will it be
it's costly.
effective? Right.
Yeah, with all these drones and short range missiles, and they the troop casualties will grow, and some estimates, some scholars are suggesting by January, the death toll on US side could rise significantly into thousands if it continues on this path. Yeah, so your thoughts, Ben and Oliver, on this broadening of conflict and prospects of ground invasion, and any prospects that, Oliver, you see on the Russia-Ukraine front that I don't know, give you any hope.
I'd like to thank you, Samantha. I'd like to hear from Ben though, because I haven't. I don't think Ben has spoken directly yet. Have you, Ben, about the Ukraine conflict?
Yes, I mean, it's been shocking to me how long this has seemingly dragged on for, and uh, how normalized the situation appears to be. I'm especially, and maybe this will be a good future discussion to have, but I'm somewhat surprised at the what seems like the lack of initiative and imagination by uh, people in Europe, as well as other governments that are particularly affected by the war in Ukraine, as well as the war in Iran. I'm thinking actually specifically of India, and I would, Samantha, maybe we can talk about this more sometime. But I'm wondering why these countries that are being so badly affected economically by these wars are not trying to put more pressure on the Americans to limit these kinds of things or to wrap them up. Maybe even pressure on the Russians or Iranians as well. Why are they not organizing together as much as they could be? I mean, India is part of the BRICS as well as the UAE and Iran. They seem very connected to this conflict, and it's strange that Pakistan is taking such an active role, but India seems to be kind of absent from that. And the Europeans just unable, unwilling to try to talk to Russia, their largest neighbor, which is always going to be there, whether they like it or not.
Right.
So they're kind of it seems like they're letting other powers uh, take control of things that are of absolute importance to their national security, to their economic life. And I just hope, like we've discussed a bit with some of these Arab countries around the Gulf, that uh, these countries will start to be more imaginative about what their security arrangement can be and what their relationships with their neighbors can be, and what the relationship to the United States can be, and to not rely so much on a country as unstable as the United States is, with a president that is frankly screaming at these countries every single day that we are not a reliable partner, and you need to start working together fast to find a way, an alternative way to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. If I may just, no, yeah, thanks for that, Ben. Yeah, President Trump, one of two or three times just in this one day, I've been truly shocked by statements from Trump or from his administration. One doesn't know where to begin, but let me just throw into the mix the fact that he's just put on another is it 10 to 12% tariffs on top of all the other tariffs on 60 nations if they have labor laws that somehow fail to come up to the standards of the United States? Should one start with Peter Hegseth in that vomit-inducing performance in giving evidence to a Senate inquiry, wasn't it, just yesterday? So he already says he spent is it something like 37 or 38 billion dollars on this? I think, by the way, that's a grave underestimate. But let's take it at 38 billion. And what is it? He wants 63 billion more, and it's not at all clear. What is it for? What is your plan? Do you have a plan upon which you can justify calling on the American people for a further 63 billion? And let us not forget that the Congress, as far as I can make out, I know it's not totally complete yet, the process, but basically the Congress has agreed to the NDAA, which is another 1.3 billion. And by the way, I noticed that the House, in approving it, has kept in the business about the United States Army working very closely with the Israeli Army and sharing intelligence and all of that. And the question is, so where does this even begin to be remotely democratic? It's Christian, you made a wonderful statement the last time we were on this show about the rise of discontent, particularly amongst younger younger voters, with all the things that Israel has been doing. And now we get a bill that almost seems to have passed through the entirety of Congress that wants to see a greater fusion, a merger. Almost. I mean, that's an exaggeration to call it a merger, but some kind of fusion between what? The U.S. Army and who? The Israeli Army? You mean that's the army that's been responsible for the genocide in Gaza? The army that is killing and harassing innocent Palestinians in the West Bank? The army that has invaded south of Lebanon, the army that has invaded the south of Syria, contrary to every conceivable notion of international law. Shoot.
Well, it's a very cynical ploy, right? That fusion that was written into that bill was a way for politicians to continue this support without the negative political hit of voting on an agreement, an ongoing agreement, another 10 years, 20-year agreement on this. It's as if thinking that the public isn't paying attention, isn't listening right now. I'm as someone running to represent, 800,000 plus people in my district, as someone who's running to represent our country in the legislature and the House of Representatives. I fundamentally understand how continuing America's strength, America's, position in this world is going to make tangible benefits for the people in my district. The fact that we are still using the United States dollar as a petrodollar is a great boon to the people in our district, all across our country. The fact that we're able to leverage our strength economically, militarily, comes back and it makes our economy stronger. It makes the families who are here stronger. It's certainly something that we should have at home and a vested interest in promoting. However, at the same time, in order to promote that, we're not going to be able to do that by bombing our way there. I remember the adage, I think my father said this to me on more than one occasion when I was growing up. When you find yourself in a hole, quit digging. In that matter, just stop digging. If America is going to be, if we're going to take back our position as that, strong central power in this world, if we're going to be a power that's moving us towards more stability, if we're going to bring back a global system that's going to serve as many people as possible, but certainly serve Western interests, we have to do that through diplomacy. We have to do that through friendships, through alliances. We have to do that through growing a system where everybody has a stake in preserving the outcome. And sometimes, that means reaching out to your current enemies and creating a system where you both have a stake in maintaining a peaceful outcome. And I just don't see it with this administration, obviously. But what worries me the most, and this is something that you brought up, is that we have people who are in the opposing party right now, hawks, who don't seem to understand that America's strength comes through, a shared vision that the rest of the world is going to want to get behind. Our strength comes through alliances of people who want to help move us towards that vision. It certainly doesn't come through unilaterally just trying to bomb people into submission. And we've seen how that has imploded just dramatically across the board. But yeah. Well, thank you all, gentlemen, for all of your thoughts and perspectives today.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah. Unless anyone has a last moment thought, inspiration, flash of genius, let it out now.
Yeah, the flash of genius. So increasing number of young voters, according to some surveys, are showing increasing skepticism with this kind of foreign policy, but also with the idea of capitalism as pushed forward by the U.S. Billionaire class. So I think those are some interesting thoughts. If only those changes and an openness apparently towards alternative ideas like socialism. I mean, if only some of these could actually percolate, and we will see in midterms. We have our very own Christian fighting the good fight, and yeah, some kind of new thinking, if it can be pushed into the system. Well, that's the hope.
Yep. Okay. Well, guys, a wonderful conversation, even though the topics are very dire, of course, but it's a great pleasure and a joy to be able to talk about these things freely in such a cordial atmosphere that you guys bring to this. So until the next time.